Good morning to you. It's an absolutely beautiful morning. I hope you all appreciated it. I'm hoping that I'm going to surprise some of you at least several times today in this lecture. I'm going to be saying a few things that are not in the history books that I think you'll find most intriguing, and making some suggestions about what's on the horizon. The origin of this lecture is really a lecture that Mr. Hall gave at the beginning of this year. Some of you may remember it. He was talking about international trends, I believe, and he suddenly paused in the midst of the lecture and said, "What I'm about to say is so shocking, it's going to take some explanation and foundation." He went off and gave a long speech about the Renaissance that happened in England about 400 years ago. And he then said that astrological configurations seemed to indicate that it was time for another such renaissance now. Now, it's been a personal pet project of mine for many, many years, far before I came to PRS, the idea of a renaissance, bringing about a creative revolution. Because it seemed to me, watching television and just talking to people and all sorts of experiences like that, that the world desperately needed an influx of creativity and imagination and dedication and vision. So when I heard this from the maestro himself, I thought, aha, now's the time to get busy and really find out if the indications are there. Look into it sociologically, look into it astrologically, look into it every way you can think of. And so this lecture is my report to you and a public statement about the feasibility of a renaissance. I'm going to begin with the same way that he did, with some historical background, and I think the surprises will start right there. This is not a situation that can be understood from the perspective of our limited personal lives. Within that context, we look around us at the world and we think, oh, the world is just so huge, and there's so much to do. How can I possibly contribute? What can I do to improve the situation? There's too much resistance out there, too much negativity, too many people who are greedy. How do you get past them? That sort of idea. Well, first we look into history. And what we discover is that history needs to be understood not as a bunch of random events that took place on this particular globe, in this particular, not especially important part of the cosmos, but rather that every part of the cosmos is important, and that a divine presence and wisdom suffuses every part of the cosmos, and that includes human history, if you know how to look for it. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that the event that is about to happen, and about to could mean 100 years from now, don't get me wrong about tomorrow or a week from now, actually has its foundations, I would suggest, about 6,000 years in the past. I would further suggest that it's a uniquely Western motion, although the East has been involved in it as a kind of parent or a midwife, and that the origin is to be found in Egypt. So now we're going to do a little history, and I hope you'll have some fun. We start out with the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who changed his name to Akhenaten. It is very appropriate that this lecture and these ideas are being discussed here now, because of course if you look outside you will see the Egyptian statues that include Akhenaten's hymns to Aton. They adorn the outside of this establishment. And in a sense, this establishment is the fruition of an effort that began all the way back then. What Akhenaten did was come to the decision that the teachings available to Pharaoh, teachings of spirituality, psychology, all the things that made a person free, independent, gave them the ability to survive by their own decisions and not be ordered around, that those things should be given to everyone. The priests had become too strong in Egypt at that time. They completely dominated the culture and kept the populace in ignorance because they were much easier to rule that way. Akhenaten did a very courageous thing in that he rejected all the worships except that of Aton, who was a god represented by the solar disk of the sun and was in every way similar to the Christian God, a God of goodness, friend to the suffering, that sort of thing. The result, you can predict, he was killed within his own lifetime, poisoned, and his closest followers were exiled. Religion was stamped out, except that there was a certain individual from another race who was being trained as a pharaoh and was influenced by the teachings of Akhenaten, and his name was Moses. And Moses took his place in this amazing pageant of history, which was to take the essence of Akhenaten's teachings and find the appropriate situation for them to flourish. That situation was a very stubborn, very primitive tribe of slaves called the Hebrews. And it was a brilliant idea if you think about it. Here was an Egyptian pharaoh, in everything but name, knew how to command people, knew how to instill devotion in them, who then took this monotheism, this religion of comparative freedom, and brought it to a tribe that would fiercely protect it and has protected it for over 5,000 years. But priestcraft being what it is, even among the Hebrews, there became a kind of coarsening, thickening of the arteries sort of experience. And along came somebody else, the Essenes. Very interesting group of people, wore white robes, vegetarian, extremely dedicated to spiritual rigors. Who were they? Some say that they were a tribe of the Levites. Some say that they were Hindu Brahmins. My suggestion to you, based on Anacalypsis and other sources, is that they were not, that they were Druids. All their doctrine perfectly matches that of the Druids. Now, you'll see in a moment why that's especially interesting. Out of the Essenes emerges Jesus. And Jesus says, too many priests. Religion has to go inside. You've got to be your own priest. Got to get rid of all these laws that are unnecessary. You need to have a real relationship with God. Well, that religion spread into Europe, into the East, even into Africa. However, once again, priestcraft. Priests got in there and said, boy, we can use this and really get ourselves situated in a nice, safe position. And they did, all over the world. I mean, just imagine, if you haven't had this experience, when it says in the Bible, has Jesus saying, go into your closets and pray. Don't let one hand know what the other is doing, all that stuff. And here you have a bunch of priests telling you exactly what to do in public. All wrong. What next, then? Well, if this experiment is going to continue, we now need to find another race of Hebrews, the English, who, oddly enough, often refer to themselves as the missing tribe and have a lot of pride about their connections to early Christianity. They feel, in fact, that the real Christianity was brought to them by Joseph and Glastonbury. And there may be some truth to that, because if we do have a Druid connection with the Essenes, and what's happening is true Christianity is taken to England, and there we have something called the War of Roses. This is a very interesting period in history because there's a lot of roses going on. There's a Rosicrucian society in Germany, spread out in Europe, and there's the War of Roses a bit earlier in England, both of which had the same goal, approached in different ways, and that was to eliminate the Catholic influence in England, to get rid of the church and have a government that was based more on the political than on the religious. Now that becomes important with Henry VIII, who is set up, who takes his throne as a result of the War of Roses, and who then announces that he is going to be head of a church that's going to cast out all this priestcraft. It's going to make it nice and simple. Of course, his motivation was that he wanted to get many divorces, but nevertheless, the effect was the same. God's wisdom and sense of humor. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Rosicrucians are working, and the political leadership is working to throw the Catholics out of that area, and succeeding. Luther. Now what happens? Very, very interesting thing. A queen by the name of Elizabeth takes the throne. Now, most of us know very little about Elizabeth. There was a cult that surrounded her. She was referred to as Astrea, in a sense the star goddess, the virgin goddess. And the reason this was the case was that the great lights of Elizabethan England, seeing her tremendous intelligence and dedication, and, one might add, her true spiritual orientation, felt that this was the opportunity to bring a kind of second coming, a renaissance, but not in the body of one teacher, one individual, but in a whole culture. And so they compared her to the Virgin Mary. She was the one who came just before the second coming. And indeed, there was a renaissance that quickly followed her ascension to the throne. Now, one nice little thing to add along to our Egyptian statues is that by no design on my part or any other person's, today is the 427th anniversary of Elizabeth's ascension to the throne of England. Extremely symbolic, because that was the beginning of the last Renaissance. Unfortunately, a few decades passed. There was a shift in power. There was some Catholicism brought back in, a great deal of unrest. A certain kind of Protestant religious intolerance began to rear its head in England. And then the Puritans popped up, and we had the idea of going to America to found something new. Now, it's unquestionable that this idea was known way, way, way back. There are some who believe that Plato wrote about America. We know certainly that Francis Bacon was aware and involved in the establishment of the American colonies. And so we can say that the Elizabethan court had a conception of creating this nation, this experiment in freedom. And this was finally put into effect about a century after perhaps its first conception in detailed form. And then we have the founding of the United States of America. This brings us to astrology. We have some very interesting configurations going on right now. The most important of them is Pluto in Scorpio. Pluto in Scorpio means, in a nutshell, regenerate or die. Pluto in Scorpio is an extremely powerful aspect that basically strips us of all the unnecessary things and shoves us up into the forefront of where we need to be. Now let me illustrate this to you. The last time Pluto was in Scorpio was about 20 or 30 years before the founding of this nation. Very suggestive again. And what happened at that time? Well, you had a nation that for a good long period was content to be under the domination of the crown. And all of a sudden, you had two sorts of people, kind of division, the division between the sheep and the goats, if you like. Some said, we should just stay a colony, Tories. But then there were more and more thinkers, writers, politicians who said, no, 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 no. We've got to get free of England. We've got to really establish freedom. They got hot coals in their pants. And they basically declared war, or maneuvered war, against the most powerful military presence in Europe. An impossible venture. And of course, they won, because nothing's impossible. Look what's happening now. We have our Tories. We have people who are telling us things are getting out of hand. They're too wild, too crazy. We've got to get back to the way it was, conservative. Just keep it nice and controllable and don't need to change anything. Just need to get it right back down to basics. It's not working. The debt rises. Education gets worse and worse. Then you have another group of people becoming more and more vocal. People like the writers of such books as Megatrends and the Aquarian Conspiracy, and undoubtedly people like most of you here today, who say, no, 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 there's a change coming, and there's got to be a change. We need more freedom. We need to be more independent. Each person has to have their own relationship to these things. We should have jobs that we enjoy, not just that we have to do for survival. In other words, we need the freedom to express ourselves creatively, more than we are allowed to now. In the last year, the major complaint that I've been hearing from people about our culture is that they wish to really give something to it. Perhaps an artist who's very committed to an idealistic art form and cannot find a way to promulgate it, finds obstacles in business, in the hierarchies of power, illogical obstacles, bumps ahead over and over and over again against them. This is the same kind of problem in a different field that was faced by Americans just before the American Revolution who wanted to establish certain kinds of activities. The Crown had to approve everything. Now, the Crown these days is not a royal family in a distant land. The Crown instead is the powers that be. That's simple. People who are dedicated to their selfish ends and who, as a result, are an obstacle of sorts. Now, I don't think anyone would disagree with me that the world situation at this time and in the last decade has been pretty alarming, perhaps more so than ever before in history. So many problems to choose from if you want to be neurotic and not sleep at night. You can think about the debt situation and the imminent collapse of the government as a result, if you want to take it to that extreme. You can think about World War III and nuclear annihilation being imminent. You can think about genetic engineering unleashing strange organisms into the atmosphere that will poison everybody. There's just endless things to think about to get depressed. But that tells you something. There's an old German poem that says that when it gets darkest, that's when the guardian light is born. And things are pretty dark. So, what do you do when it gets dark? What does it look like when, if you were, let's put you in God's shoes for a minute. Or let's say some being that's in charge of the earth, whichever. You look down and you say, oh boy, it looks bad. They're really getting out of hand down here. What are we going to do about it? Simple solution. Open up the faucet, let some more spiritual waters flow in, Wake them up a little bit. All kinds of people down there saying, I'd really love to do something, and they only halfway mean it. And in the past, we've taken them at their halfway and thought, well, won't bother them. But now, even if they only 1/4 mean it, wham! Strange dreams, all kinds of experiences, clairaudience, all this stuff starts to burst loose, happening all around us. So there is a kind of current in the air. And we can call it, if you like, Pluto in Scorpio. And what it means is that something has to be done to create a freer climate. Freer for one reason, because that freedom is required for the continued evolution of humanity on this planet. And this planet is a school, it's a classroom. And when the classroom curriculum gets to the point that it's actually impeding education instead of helping it, then it has to be changed. Now, we may be slow about doing that in the schools, but God is not slow about doing it in the world. It just happens. So, for example, such a fear as the fear of nuclear war has a double edge to it. Some people get very depressed and are unable to work as a result of it. But most people who have to face it get more energy because they say, I've got to do it now, or I've got to do something to change the situation, or I've got to live as fully as I can. And that's where a lot of these changes begin to come in. Because what you discover, especially if you're growing up, let's say in the baby boomer generation, is that you think that, maybe drugs and sexuality and alcohol, that those are the ways to live it up. And if you experiment with them, you soon discover that no, they're not. That actually they're a rather unpleasant experience. The mixture seems, as time goes on, to get more and more toward the unpleasant and away from the pleasant. So if you're smart, you start to look around. You start to say, well, what is something that I can do that's pleasurable? The most pleasurable thing in the world, the thing that's most fun that a human being can do, is spiritual self-development. The one thing that everybody seems to forget about it. Most people bring up the word spirit and you get, oh yes, I've studied all those doctrines, that sort of stuff, and they're serious. Way off the deep end. It's fun. That's the main beauty of it. That's, again, the sense of humor that's worked through the cosmos. We all look around for the thing that's most satisfying. We try everything. Old Hindu story, very wonderful. God, call him Vishnu, is up there with the angelic hierarchies, call them the other Hindu gods, and says, well, we've gotten to the end of creation now. We have to decide where we're going to put the human soul. And we want to put it somewhere that's going to keep them searching. We want to put it somewhere where they'll exhaust the entire material world, learn everything about it before they find it. Well, there are all kinds of suggestions. Put it in the bottom of the ocean. Put it on top of the tallest mountain. Bury it as far down as you can in the earth. No. They'll get there. They're stubborn creatures. Somebody thought, raised their hand up there in the assembly and said, how about putting it inside them? God said, that's it. They'll never look inside them. And it's been true as long as we have history. A few now and again look inside. But now is the time to look inside. Because Scorpio, and Pluto, of course, is its natural ruler, which intensifies this, can be described in three ways. There are kind of three, actually four levels that it's understood at. There's the Scorpion level. That's the level where you sting yourself to death and everyone around you. And I think you can see that without labor toward aiding the world situation, that's very likely what could happen. If everybody decided to give up and just let things go as they are, we'd all sting ourselves to death in one way or another. Then you've got the serpent level. I have to think about the serpent for a moment. This is the most sensuous creature of all, really. A creature that crawls in the dust and as a result feels matter with its entire body. So this is immersion in material experience, usually having to do with sexuality and those kinds of experiences. That's the second level of it, and you can see how that's very active today in our culture. Then you have level number 3, the eagle. This is where we begin to soar. This is self-transcendence. And then we get to the phoenix, rebirth. So in a sense, every one of you, everyone in the world is selecting, whether you choose to do so or not, one of those 4 totems to identify with and, in a sense, to serve. If you don't choose at all, then you get assigned the one that's most natural to you. But if you can find which one you are tuned to, if you can say, you know, I'm kind of a bitter, sarcastic, rotten individual a lot of the time, and that sounds like the scorpion. And I don't really want to be a scorpion. It's rather an unpleasant thing if I can be a phoenix. Wouldn't that be much more wonderful? So if you have the ability to see yourself as boldly as possible, to be willing to laugh and cry at what you see, then you have the ability to transform what you are. So, going back for a moment to our history, what we seem to be facing is another kind of American Revolution. Now, where might this one happen? I'd look around you and say, well, where are the changes most likely to occur? Everywhere. Because the trick to a Renaissance is that it must affect people in all walks of life. It's not enough to have a couple screenwriters and a couple poets and a couple painters and a couple musicians who really dedicate themselves to the best. And this means not only that their work has spiritual content, but that their work can stand up against the masters of all time. And there's no one doing that now. It also means, however, that doctors and carpenters and house builders and salespeople and computer technicians all are affected the same way. Now, how do you do that? Where's that dedication? Let's go into this. Let's focus on it for a moment. In experimenting with this Renaissance idea, some particular friends and myself have happened on some elements that we think are quite capable of creating a great artist from a person who simply has the inclination. It's very simple. And it goes something like this. First, you must have the inclination. You've got to have some art form that you like. You'd like to be a writer. You don't think you can, but you'd like to be. Or you'd like to be a painter. Or you'd like to be a really creative carpenter, whatever. But something that your heart calls to. It can be 5 of them, for that matter. But you start out with 1. And then you do the following. 3 things. First, you find out the tradition. This means that you seek out people who you believe are the best living exponents of that particular form. It means that you read books about people who were. It means you look at their works and really study them, really pay attention. Not in the sense of the dull study that high school taught us, but in the sense of really trying to see the work. And get yourself grounded in how these people saw the world. Don't just read the books that, for instance, if you want to be a writer, Dickens wrote, but read Dickens's letters. Read some biographies. Read about other people around him and try to see how Dickens saw the world. In so doing, you discover all sorts of aspects of yourself, and you discover all sorts of little strategies that Dickens had that made him Dickens, or any other field that you're interested in. That's one thing you do. At the same time, you practice your art. You don't practice it by having a metronome over your head all the time. You play with it. You really have fun. You don't try to write the perfect novel the first time around. You just write. Anything that comes to your mind over and over and over again. Writing is a good example. Bernard Shaw used to say that there was one way to become a writer. Write 100,000 words. After you've written 100,000 words, you're a writer. Doesn't matter who you are. Very true. Because you get the skill, you get the practice, you get the facility with words. And that's as true of any field. Build 1,000 desks and you'll be a true desk maker, that sort of thing. But, and here's the key to all this, always let your dedication and your curiosity pull you further and further into your work. Never be content. Always find the next step. Always dig deeper. Always remind yourself that you have room to improve. Now, for most of us, especially those who are starting out, that's fairly simple to do. If you're a writer of any sort, dip into the tradition of literature and let yourself be humiliated. You will be. All the famous names are there, all the Dantes and Homers and the rest. Go find them and realize that compared to them, you stink. And probably will for a long time. That's okay, but learn from them. Then, after you get to the point where either your ego is swollen up enough or you really have gotten good enough to say, well, you know, I find mistakes in Dante now. I don't think he's that good. Then, spend a half an hour watching a sunset. Because there has never been an artist born who could make something as beautiful as a sunset. The changing colors, the movement of the clouds, the whole thing. Forget it. Artists then become very humble when they look at the world around them. And if you consider for a moment that that sunset is one little tiny corner of this little tiny planet in this little tiny solar system, and that this kind of beauty is infused everywhere, you get real humble. Now, there's another side to this practice. I've just given you the exoteric, and there's also an esoteric. The esoteric is this. To make this statement publicly, but walking out on limbs is fun. There has never been and never will be a great artist who was not spiritually motivated, period. One of the most wonderful things you can do, if you have the time and inclination, is to find a field you enjoy and go back and look at the masters in it. And every single one will have read Plotinus and the Neoplatonists and the Buddhists and on and on and on and on, whatever their tradition is. And all of them will be preoccupied with spiritual questions. And another thing, all of them will say this: I don't write my work. I don't paint my paintings. They just happen. Selflessness. The key to any profession. The key to all greatness. Because the more of you there is in your activity, the worse it's going to be. Because all you can bring to it is your puny memory and your puny attention to the moment. But if you unleash that attention and just flow with everything that's in you, well, then the whole human race and the whole cosmos is writing through you. And sometimes startling things can happen. So, the arts, in other words, are perhaps the greatest spiritual discipline. Now, the reason I say the arts is because the symbolic content in music and painting and writing is a wonderful tool of self-reflection. The artist continually finds himself or herself in the work. So, for example, one day you get up and you paint a beautiful picture. You just love it, and you think that this is a breakthrough. And then in the evening, you go look at it, and you still like it, but there's a little note of darkness in there. You just sort of, and you immediately leave the room and watch TV because you don't want to face it. But a week later, you look at the same painting and you say, this isn't good. Why? And what you will inevitably find is that there was some problem, some internal stress that you put onto that painting. And that's the reason you liked it initially, because you so beautifully symbolized your problem back at yourself. But as a work of art, wasn't necessarily very good. And as you dealt with the problem and that peculiar orientation left you, then you could see it more clearly. So you see, in a sense, art is a process of psychoanalysis in a much grander fashion. But nevertheless, any form of work, any occupation can be the same, because we are constantly symbolizing parts of ourselves to ourselves. So let me tie this all together then. The activities then that we're talking about here in discovering that you really are a genius, and I want to state unequivocally that whatever your age, IQ, background, everybody here, without exception, is capable of a work of genius. Geniuses are not born. The reason it has been said that they have been born is because nobody understood how a genius happens. But when you discover that all geniuses share these certain elements, you suddenly realize that it's like alchemy. You've got to have the proper elements to work with. You've got to know how to mix them together, and you've got to be persistent and patient, have a good sense of humor about it, and if you stick it out, you will become what they call a genius. So again, in a nutshell, what you do is you find the field you want to be a genius at, you play with that field incessantly, enjoy it, do crazy things, break all the rules, and learn all the rules, and break them again. You check into the tradition in order to deepen your own understanding. In a nutshell, why do you check into tradition? Because they've done all the work you don't need to. They've discovered pitfalls that you'll just fall into. You don't need to. They've already done that. You can read about their falling into it and then not do so yourself. And then above all, spiritual practice in its simplest form. That would include something like paying attention to your dreams, keeping a dream journal, trying to understand how your dreams symbolize things to you. It means reading some material, listening to some lectures, whatever appeals to you. It means always being open to discovering some negative quantity about yourself. Always being open to that. Always asking yourself, am I arrogant? Am I this? Am I that? Why did that situation happen? And being willing to see that. Realizing that blindness about these matters is the rule and not the exception. And that the more you think you're not, the more likely you are. There's a wonderful passage in one of Mr. Hall's books, I think in Self-Unfoldment, where he says, if you think this applies to you, it doesn't. But if you think it doesn't, it does. Very good thing to think about. And you work on mainly just opening up all those doors inside, all those ducts and channels and all that stuff, getting to know it all. The monsters and the apes and the angels and everything that's inside, making friends with all of them, because they're all part of you. There's no reason to deny any of them. Because when you deny them, sometimes they kind of grab you by the neck and shake you around because they want attention from you. And until you know all the elements inside, you really can't find the right balance to make the blend work. And that's a continuing process. Years pass, and as the years pass, more and more and more of you becomes known. Your enlightenment grows. Now, there are some very simple ways that this can be facilitated. And the main one is attention. Children have the most tremendous power of attention. We always laugh and say, oh, they've got short attention spans. That's because in 5 minutes they put about 6 days worth of our attention into something, and then they get tired of it real fast. They figured it out. Off to something else. Your average adult, on the other hand, has split attention into about 50,000 different places. So he's in the dentist chair, but he's thinking about balancing the checkbook, and then he remembers a memory about this, but there's a strange pain in the knee, and all this stuff's going on. And very often, when the dentist walks in, well, I was off in my thoughts, that sort of thing. And in fact, we sometimes think that that's wonderful, that we're very deep if we do that. Not at all. Not at all. Sure, if you want to pay attention to your thoughts, if you want to think, think! But put yourself in the optimum situation for thinking. On the other hand, if you're driving along, pay attention to driving. You may see some amazing things. Really see where you are. Learn to ride the world sometimes. In other words, do nothing but just sit. And think about how, at this very moment, this globe is turning. It's moving along at its own pace, and we're just riding on it. And nothing that we do or don't do is going to destroy or save the world. We have the privilege of contributing or not contributing, and that's about it. So there's no tension that deserves to crush you. None at all. So relaxation is the thing that allows you to really pay attention. When you really relax, you realize, well, between this sentence and this one, I had nothing to do. I could just look around and see who was in the audience and look at faces and what you were wearing and your gestures and that sort of thing. And when I talk again, I focus back on what I'm saying. Those little spaces of time are everywhere. Time is incredibly rich with them. The only reason that we get into the idea that we don't have time, there's so much we'd like to do, but there's no time, is because no time up here. We build all these webs of anxieties and memories, and during those silent moments, we focus on them, and they remind us of things we have to do or we didn't do and all this kind of stuff. And as a result, we feel like we have no time. If you think about the most strenuous job you've ever held, if you really think about it, you will note that there were periods of just maybe even a half an hour at a stretch where you just didn't do anything. There were moments when you could just sit and think, or you could do this or that, and instead you found a way to make yourself busy or this sort of thing. But the point is to search for those moments and to use them, to relish them, to cherish them, because those are the moments of real discovery. And what you base the searching on is this idea, that the world is either meaningless, in which case you have no reason to be here, or it's meaningful, which is what I'm here to tell you by experience. And if it's meaningful, it is meaningful. Underline it 3 times. Every single thing in it, every event, everything your eye plays upon is meaningful, has something to tell you. So when you have those little moments of freedom, use them. See what the message is. Look around you. Look at people's faces. Look at the way they interact. Look at plants. Look at little stalks of grass coming up through concrete. Anything you notice, and you will find a little cosmic treatise there. You don't need to read books. It's all around you all the time. If you're an artist, you find endless inspiration. Because the calm, first of all, trains you to be calm in your work. And then the things you see are works by the greatest artist of all, God. If you want to learn from a great artist, that's who you learn from. So you look around at God's creation. And then you add a further challenge. And this is a very important one to this conception of creating a Renaissance. One of the biggest problems faced by people who are dedicated to these ideas is criticism. They look out at the world and they say, oh, it's so rotten. Cities are awful, and this is awful, and the television's awful, and the film is awful, and it's just all awful and bad. What a waste of time. First of all, if you really want to have some fun, challenge yourself to find what's good in it, because if it exists, it has something good in it. There's a reason for it to be here. A very simple-minded example was the one I gave earlier, that nuclear weapons are sure helping to accelerate people. People used to think, well, you know, I've got years and years and years, or somebody saying, I may not have years, I better do it right now. And you may not be thinking that way, but it's buzzing around in your unconscious, I assure you. So you look around and you say, well, how is this good? Why is this necessary? What is it motivating that's useful? That's a good challenge. And then, of course, if you happen to be talented in the particular field, instead of complaining, you do something about it. If I had a dime for every time I've overheard somebody say, oh, television is just so awful, where are the people, then, to write good television? Yes, they have a hard time getting in there. They have a hard time dealing with all the idiosyncrasies of the field. But I've got news for you folks. It's going to change. It'll have to, because it's slowly dying out under itself. And that's the nature of all these things that decay. They fall apart of their own weaknesses. And that brings us to Taoism. Taoism, I think, can be described best in terms of the cliché, going with the flow. But then you have to deepen that. You have to realize that the flow is in everything, that the flow is in the wood grain and the chairs that you're sitting, and the ocean and the wind and the earth and the gravitational fields and all that stuff, and in human life. And that flow is the life that you live. As Oscar Wilde once said, life is something that happens to you while you're doing something else. That's the big problem that most of us face, is that we have this busy idea. I want this life. I want to be like this. We're not willing to do it. So, for example, you get the character who says, oh, I've always dreamt about being a great composer. I'd love to do that. You know, and someone comes along like me, a fearful optimist, and says, well, do it. Doesn't matter how old you are. And they say, great, I'm going to do it. And then suddenly they realize, well, I've got all this stuff to learn. Well, it's just not worth it. I mean, maybe I really don't want to do that. And life just kind of keeps on flowing by. Things happen to them. Instead, focus on what happens to you. So, for example, if you are called to arms as an artist, you'll know it. The opportunities will be there. You'll meet the right people, make the right contacts. But you've got to give it a chance. You've got to give it a year or 2 years. You've got to be willing to make a fool out of yourself, take a risk. Do what people don't think you should do. And why do you do that? Taoism has been described as a passive philosophy, but I would say that it is not, that it is the most courageous of all philosophies, because you are giving up control. And this brings us back to the artistic process again. If you maintain control over a poem, the poem stinks. But if you let go of a poem, well, you may write a really beautiful one. And that tends to be the story in life. If you control your life, unpleasant. But if you live life, and what that means is pay attention to everything that happens and try to drink it to its depths. Transform the things you don't like by discovering what you don't like about them and replacing that with things you do like. Open communication. Admit your idiosyncrasies. All that stuff. Be honest and truthful and loving and all those words that people use but don't practice. They don't work if you talk about them. You've got to do them. If you do them, they work. And that's, of course, the great irony in all this. The only blockade between this culture giving birth to the greatest renaissance ever seen on this planet is fear and selfishness. That's it. Nothing else. If a sufficient majority of people simply said, what have we got to lose? Let's try it. Let's really push ourselves to our limits. Let's think this way for a moment. If there is such a thing as reincarnation, it doesn't change the fact that this life is this life. These people and this body and this situation in time are here now and will not happen again. Let me really enjoy them and use them to the greatest depth that I can. Let me really appreciate life. Then again, if you believe that there is not reincarnation but immortality of the soul, same situation. This is your one life on earth, the only one you get. And if you convince yourself that, well, you suffer down here so you get the good stuff up there, there's a whole bunch of people who have been here to tell you, on the contrary, you can have up there down here. Heaven is available right now if you open yourself to it. And then finally, if you're a materialist and you say, well, you just die, all the more reason to really live for the amount of time that you have. Now, there's a funny thing among metaphysicians. I call it the do-gooder immortality syndrome. That is, that somehow we feel deep down inside in some primitive part of ourselves that if we have good intentions, and we really do nice things for people now and again, and we're spiritually inclined, that somehow, well, maybe we'll be around long enough to do the things we want to accomplish. You know, you sort of feel like it's a pact with God. It's a very primitive sort of feeling, but it's very, very pervasive among people that you feel, well, you know, I'm a good person, so I probably have at least 2 weeks, a year or two, maybe a few decades, that sort of thing. But what everybody needs to realize is that you can go just like that. The other side, in my personal belief system, blinking and thinking, oh no, I blew it again. Why do I keep getting so fascinated and just stand there kind of drooling while the world goes by and then wham, get knocked out again? Use your time. If you don't feel that you can commence an activity, then help somebody else commence one. Give whatever support you can, your wisdom, your opinions, your criticism, anything. Talk about these ideas. Encourage people to take these risks. And encourage this, excellence. We have a lot of New Agers, a word that is quickly becoming ugly. And there's a very simple reason why it's becoming ugly, because New Agers, as a genera, forget two things. First of all, the New Age is not going to be, suddenly the clouds open and everybody's enlightened and it's so Marvy. That's not what happens. That's not the way life works. You work hard. Yes, the New Age brings opportunities, but you work awfully hard to make them real. That's the way it's always been. And the other major problem that New Agers have, especially New Age artists, is the good enough syndrome. Sort of, well, it's good enough. It got across my feeling, that sort of thing. It's better than the other stuff out there. But you've got to stand that good enough up against people with the dedication of William Blake, William Shakespeare, Manuel Swedenborg, people who really created masterpieces of their spiritual beliefs. Why did they do this? Because they wanted to be universally recognized? Not at all. Blake never was recognized in his lifetime, and Swedenborg, until the day he died, hid all this stuff, published it anonymously. They did it because excellence, masterwork, was what it required to communicate these ideas. It was the only way you could really reach people to the depth that you needed to. Because the simple fact of the matter is, if you create a work of art, or a chair for that matter, that is just so, then the magnetism, if you like, that you introduce into the person's environment who buys that work of yours is just so. It's mediocre. And so you can walk into a gallery of New Age art, look around and think, well, it's, this is nice, and this, but you kind of walk out of there and you just feel like the old joke about a Chinese meal. But if you go to the Tate Gallery in London and take a look at the Blake exhibition, it will affect you for years, decades. That's how powerful the vision is. That's how well constructed the expression of it has been. New Agers are very fond of saying that they have a kind of direct tap. That's what we all really go for. We want to be spiritually connected. That's the key. Prove it. Show me the artist whose work is so brilliant, so astounding, so full of wisdom and grace that you have to stand in awe in front of that work. I haven't found one yet in this particular time. So you don't sit there and say to yourself, well, we just live in terrible times. No. Do it yourself. Encourage other people to do it. Nothing to stop us. Nothing. You may discover that you have a natural facility for the art you love, and you may be 80 years old, but by the time you're 82, you've mastered it, and when you're 83, you write a tremendous masterpiece, and when you're 84, you pass on. But boy, do you have a smile on your face. Because not only did you create a masterwork, not only did you get one last good punch in, but all those people who say, well, after 60's life's over, you just gave them a good kick in the pants, too. This is thinking creatively, not accepting limitations. Better to fall, completely fail and perish in the attempt to create something great than to never attempt at all. Why do you think all these fellows starved? Their families broke up, all this stuff. They were not mentally ill. They got something out of it, the importance. They knew that this work, so full of spiritual luminosity, had to be done. Complete dedication. Some took it perhaps to too much of an extreme. But the point is the recklessness, the creative audacity. That's what we need today. And proof is quite simple. It is this. In the last 100, 200 years, on the whole, maybe longer, we have not exercised this kind of philosophy as a culture. The philosophy has basically been a nice, quiet life. I find mine, you find yours. As long as you don't step on mine, that's okay, that sort of thing. Let other people make the decisions. And the result is that we have a world on the verge of annihilating itself and a need for some panic measures to fix it up. It doesn't work. Look at it in your own lives for a moment. If you've ever had a period in your life, usually it comes early on, but it might not, where you've just sort of floated along. Not the Taoist floating, where you took everything that came to you and pushed it as far as you could. But just floating along, just the easy job and the easy friends and the easy relationship and all the easy stuff. No demands. Always puts you in a hole. You always find yourself miserable, suicidal perhaps, at the end of a couple years, maybe a decade, maybe 2 decades of it. It just doesn't work. And what you discover and what people tell you at that point is you got to take your life into your hands. Create something. Be daring. Make some decisions. Take some risks. So why not do it before you're forced to do it? For survival. Why not do it when you don't need to worry about survival, when you can enjoy doing it? And one of the great benefits about it is this. It's fun. It's fun to be audacious. It's fun to shock people with your projects. It's one of the loveliest experiences that I have when sometimes somebody says, Manly Hall, is he still alive? And I say, yes, he's working on 5 books. How old is he? 84, 85, somewhere in that vicinity. That's audacious. You're not supposed to be able to write 5 books at once when you're 85 years old and give lectures on every other Sunday. It's insane. But it's fun just to see the expression on the faces of people who don't think it's possible. Because as people interested in spirituality, folks, your business is the impossible. And your greatest service is to teach people that the impossible is possible and is with you all the time. We carry around pictures of the world. We decide that this is the way it is, based on culture, parents, whatever, that you can do this, you can't do that, you have to be content with it. Never, ever take things on hearsay like that. Remember what Bacon had to say about Aristotelian approaches to things. Never take it from books, never take it from authorities. If there was somebody in the audience here who came up to me after the lecture and said, I agreed with everything you said, I just thought it was wonderful, my question would be, have you lived it? Have you tried it? I may be lying. If it makes sense to you, try it. Really put it into practice. And don't be selective in the way that you try it. So, for example, if you are a metaphysician, you call yourself spiritually oriented, but you don't pray. Praying is not something that you do. It's just goofy. Or you come up with one of the wonderful rational explanations for prayer, which is, well, but if God's all-knowing, then that must mean that he already knows what I want, and therefore I don't have to pray. That sort of thing. Try it. There's a reason why people of the magnitude of St. Augustine said prayer does miracles. As an example, it took me about 4 years to overcome that kind of attitude about it and to try it out in a kind of surly manner, saying, well, I don't know if anybody's listening, but I mean, just in case, I'd kind of like it if, this happened. It did. Now, it depends on what you ask for. If you say, I'd like suddenly the world to be turned into a giant orange, you have to be reasonable. And the inner things are the best things to ask about of all. I need more patience. Help me overcome my anger. Help me be more creative. Help me be more attentive. Help me understand more. That works. Call it hypnotic suggestion, call it prayer, call it meditation, whatever you want. It works. It establishes a certain presence. And if we're going to create a Renaissance, which we are going to do, then it's going to be necessary to be as awake as we possibly can be. Sleepiness has caused enough trouble. We need to now create in wakefulness. No systems, no tried and true, yes, this is the way it is, logical. None of that stuff, because you don't know what logic is. You may wind up contradicting yourself tomorrow. But the point is to have the daring to express yourself today, and to do that in the very best manner that you can, with the greatest commitment, the greatest dedication. And this suggestion has about 3 levels that I think make it very attractive. Number 1, I promise you that you will find fulfillment in this kind of dedication undreamt of. The joys, the frustrations, the pleasures, unbelievable. And the greater you become as an artist, and the more deeply you understand your tradition, the more connected you are spiritually, the more wondrous, miraculous life becomes at every moment. And when you can convey a little bit of that miracle in some form, what a thrill. Absolutely nothing like it. Then on another level, social conscience. The world needs you. Here's a PRS, dedicated to freedom. Study all religions, study all philosophies, work out your own salvation. This is one of the only places on the face of the earth that doesn't have any dogma that you have to ascribe to come here. If people from the PRS don't do it, who is going to do it? In a certain respect, you are the elite. You are the ones who value freedom. It is useless if you simply keep it to yourself. It's the expression of that freedom that is important. And finally, on a third level, a little bit abstract, a little bit metaphysical, what does God do? Well, as far as we know, God creates. It's the easiest thing to point out about God. I mean, we can get into abstractions about the Kabbalah and this and that. But let's just say God creates. That's the way most people think of God, the creator. So if you want to live a godly life, create. And of course, it's deeper than that. You are creating all the time. If you are not creating consciously, then you are very likely creating what we might call garbage. And this is not only in your work, this is also in your personal relationships. You are saying and doing things that are destructive for no reason other than the fact that you are too lazy to correct the situation. Be conscious of what you are creating. Be conscious of what you say to people. Be conscious of how you appear to them and of the example that you give. Because you can talk a blue streak about metaphysics, and if your life doesn't show any sparkle, no one is going to listen. It's my personal pet theory that of all the different approaches to these subjects, the Christianity, Buddhism, all the organized approaches, that this approach, this eclectic approach, where you work out your own salvation, is the true, esoteric, most honest approach. Because these are the bodhisattvas who step out, and they don't know where they're going. They're standing on the end of the cliff, and they're going to walk off. No guidelines at all. There's some general things. You know that it's not good to be angry. It's not good to criticize. It's not those things, yes. The spiritual virtues or the personal virtues, definitely important things to practice. But in terms of what you're going to discover out there, who knows? That's part of the excitement. Now, I also happen to think that this particular form of spiritual practice is the most fun. Because it's a little tiresome to be told, yes, when you die, this is what happens, and then you have these experiences, and the angels do. I mean, really. I'd rather find out when I get there. Also, I think it's the most creative approach, because once again, in these long studies of all these different artists and writers, and including great politicians and all sorts of people like that, they all had this kind of approach. Even the ones who said they were Christians of their own sort. The Buddhists who said they were Buddhists of their own sort. All these great leaders left to us in history were people who traveled the path of learning, never assuming, seeking to understand, not projecting your desires as a structure out there in the world. So again, as being a listener to this particular lecture, being called here for whatever purpose to hear, there's a special responsibility accruing to you. Because, if 10 people in this room utterly dedicated themselves to this kind of spiritual greatness and to bringing it to others, we would have a renaissance. 10 people is all it takes. Handful of the arts involved, a couple other fields, and real dedication and sharing, networking, that kind of thing. That's it. That's all the encouragement that has to happen. Especially when you consider that there are other people in other places, I would suggest a little bit less well situated in terms of a tradition to pull on, but nevertheless, there are many people who are doing this now. All kinds of new businesses popping up, that sort of thing. What do they look like? Well, flexible hours, a lot of technology, a lot of desire to have a sense of freedom in your work, of creativity, of self-accomplishment and self-esteem, those kind of things. Instead of having a manager who tells you what to do, everybody shares because everybody's essential to the business. This is becoming a major trend. Bestseller book, Megatrends, is about nothing but that. A lot of influence coming into this now. Now, I suggest to you that those people who are putting together these new forms are our Thomas Paines and our Jeffersons. And that they will do the same thing that Thomas Paine and Jefferson did. They will outdate the other systems. Because what happened to the Tories in this nation when the American Revolution occurred was not that they were violently all killed and taken out and hung. They became outdated. They just disappeared like dinosaurs. And this is what will happen over a period of years in this culture as we reach for a new level of freedom. The old forms that do not allow for this kind of development will slowly fade away. And if you don't believe it, take a look at the stock market. Yes, it's doing nicely, but take a look at the old industries, steel and automobiles and all that stuff. Take a look at the computers, all that stuff. It's not just the technology. It's the fact that most computer firms provide you with a really lovely place to work. Incentives, networking, cooperation. And people like that. It's good for them. The time is quickly coming when no one should have to work in a job that destroys their stability, their creativity, and their very soul. That has been a form of slavery that has afflicted humanity for too long. Technology makes that unnecessary. So that brings us back to Pluto and Scorpio. Isn't that fancy? Because that's the same approach, right? That's the energy of renewal, the phoenix, the rebirth, something new bursting onto the scene. Now you have several ways to respond to it. I think that the culture itself will convince you that this is the truth. Just go out and take a look at some of the bestsellers and this sort of thing. Read a few articles, turn on the TV. These ideas are being popped out at you. But how do you respond to them? You can say, oh, well, that's foolish idealism, and reject it. Fine. You can say, on the other hand, well, maybe it's true. It would be nice, but I really don't want to go out on a limb. That's fine, too. But if you really want to have some fun, say, this sounds great. It may be completely harebrained, but it makes sense to me. So I'm going to throw everything I've got into it just to see what happens. Because if enough people throw everything they've got into harebrained schemes get realized. Because just about every major innovation in the history of humanity has been a harebrained scheme. You can go all the way back to the first person who figured out drinking milk from cows. I mean, can you imagine? Picture the village, some mother not able to provide milk. How about the milk from the cow? Oh, God, that's disgusting. That's sort of approach, right? A harebrained scheme. So what we're talking about is that there is an intensity in the air that permits harebrained schemes to proliferate and flourish. And so my suggestion then is to take advantage and to really enjoy the harebrained schemes and crack a few of your own and get involved in other people's and see what happens. And getting involved in other people's brings me to a short aside, an observation about this particular place and about culture in general. And that is isolation. I think that there are probably enough people in this room to start about 4 businesses if you knew each other, if you talked. If, for example, there was a person with this particular connection and a person with that particular set of finances and a person with this skill, and they all really wanted to accomplish this, and they're all sitting here listening, thinking, boy, wouldn't that be wonderful? Never meet. Because even if they do get outside and chat above coffee and tea, they don't really get around to those inner, what do you do? Oh, well, I'm a computer technician. But deep inside, I want to be a composer who does, that sort of thing. Usually you don't bring those out until you know somebody pretty well. My suggestion is bring them out, talk, be open, meet people. Because that's another very important element in this. This is not a kind of forceful going out there and finding people and shaking them up so that they'll work with you, that sort of thing. This is simply maximizing your potential to be connected with others. So, for example, it is a fact that at this moment, all of you have been thrown into this room. You're all here. That has several levels of opportunity to it. There's a level of opportunity that means that you don't look at anybody else here and you leave immediately when it's over. And there is another level of opportunity, perhaps a little more of a pest, but certainly deeper, at which you introduce yourself to everybody here. Pass out your card. Start a little newsletter. I'm looking for, what are you looking for? Now that very badly needs to happen here. It also very badly needs to happen all over the culture. If you live in a hotel, that was a great slip actually, as you'll see in a moment, in a condominium or apartment building, you may as well be living in a hotel because usually you don't know anybody else in the building, or at least a couple people here and there. Communal living has vanished. Who knows what kind of contacts you have on your street? if you were open to meeting them, if instead of scowling when you walked by, smiled and started up a conversation. The really wonderful thing, the amazing thing is how many times you discover in life that the major changes, the major breakthroughs come to you just out of nowhere. One day you get up, you're feeling kind of grumpy, a phone rings, stranger on the other line. Your cousin told me that you were interested in this and that. Well, I've got this idea that I'd like to put together, and that turns into IBM or something like this. This is what happens. Apple Computers, for instance, was put together by one man who knew two other men and thought, gee, if I got these people together, something could happen, and boy, did it. That's really all it takes. Communication, openness, sharing, and daring. Lots of daring. Daring to speak to people, daring to have your dreams broken to pieces, not only by experience, but also, maybe even more importantly, by others who have the same dream more completely realized. And your reaction to those two situations is the key to what you accomplish in life. Because if you react with, oh, I'm crushed, it's all over now, well, obviously, then you have accepted failure as your stereotype. But if, on the other hand, you say, boy, what a great opportunity. I had this dream, but this fellow has this dream, and it's 3 years further down the line, so I can really learn a lot. Or, yeah, this didn't work. It just crumbled around my feet. But boy, did I learn a lot when it crumbled. I now know what not to do. And maybe a couple things that worked, that I should do. Life is an experiment. Also comes into this then. Experiment with things. See how much you can accomplish. But balance it. This is one other problem that we have in facing this kind of dedication, and that is that always remember your most important work of art is your immediate relationships. If you're the greatest artist in the world, but everybody despises you, especially your family, something's wrong. Now, it is possible that you have a family of ogres, it's happened, and they absolutely refuse to allow you to be creative, and you have to therefore cut them off at the neck to be able to even write a poem at peace. That does happen, and you can struggle for 10 years to transmute them, and they resist. It can happen. Very, very seldomly. Instead, always look for a harmonious environment. If there's stress, if there's strain in it, see to it. Because when you get these internal relationships, well, actually, when you get the personal relationships that correspond to internal relationships, in other words, relations between parts of yourself, straightened out, your creativity explodes. There's a very simple reason for this. If you are worried because your mother-in-law is constantly nagging you, and you want to get her off your back before you reach your 70th birthday, and she's very long-lived, you cannot be very creative. If all you're thinking about is going out and finding somebody to get married to, or just to move in with, or just to see for a night, you can't be very creative. If all you want to do is make lots of money so you can get a big house somewhere and impress people, you can't be very creative, because your attention is going into these other things. So to a certain degree, you make a kind of deal. You give as much attention as you can to your creative work, but you also admit at the same time that you should be open to these other experiences. And you'll find, like Solomon, that because what you've asked for is nothing but the highest, to be, in a sense, a spiritual voice in a material world, that the rest is added onto you. It may not be in exactly the way that you wanted it to, but really that's your problem to adjust to. You've got to see why what you got is better than what you wanted. Another wonderful meditational practice, by the way. The essence, the kernel of all this can be described as spiritual alchemy. Most of us know alchemy as a kind of pseudoscience, where there was the attempt to turn lead into gold. But if you replace lead with the idea of, your negative emotions, those parts of yourself that are most heavy and useless, And gold as being the brightest parts, the most valuable. And you can see that it's a fine allegory for self-development. So let's talk then about spiritual alchemy for a moment. Because all this highfalutin talk about renaissances and these techniques and dedications is absolutely useless if there isn't one foundational practice underneath it, which I only briefly alluded to, and that is what we can call spiritual alchemy. That means that you sit down with yourself one day, you get nice and calm and relaxed, maybe get a piece of paper and a pen, and then you think about who you are. And you write down, well, I get very irritable about this. I've got a bad temper about that. I'm accused of being a hypochondriac, but I don't believe it. Just write it down anyway. All that stuff. Anything you've ever been accused of or thought maybe you were like that, write them all down. All the negative ones first. Then write down the things you're proud of. Now, what normally happens, so if you do this, don't feel upset, is that you get this giant list of negative ones and about 2 on the positive side. Now, there is a tendency to be overly self-critical, but then what you do is you pick out one of the negative ones, the one that looks the worst to you, a really hairy one. You say, okay, what am I going to do about it? I've got to work on this. You say, a little prayer about it. Please help me do this. That's very helpful. And then you begin to cultivate the virtue that goes with the vice. So, for example, you're impatient. That's usually a big one. Everything's got to happen right now. Well, you cultivate patience, and you do it very deliberately. So you do things like you start a project you know you are not going to be able to finish for a year. And sure, for the first week or two, you're frustrated. But then you begin to get used to the idea that, well, some things take time to develop. And then you begin to notice the wonders of patience. How actually, sometimes, if you're patient, things go faster, in fact, always, than when you're impatient. If you're irritable with a certain person, why? Ask yourself. You may get the answer. Always ask yourself, first of all, are they like me in some way that annoys me? Am I not seeing the same quality in me? If that's the case, correct it in yourself. Usually the situation becomes much quieter. On the other hand, you may not be able to figure out what it is, so then do something that nobody ever thinks of doing. The last ditch effort. Talk to the person. Say, there's one thing you do that, I don't want to get you mad, do all that stuff. And say, but there's one thing that you do that irritates me, and I don't know why. I don't want to be irritated. Let's talk about it. And you may discover that what's really going on is that they do this thing because they're trying to symbolize to you their irritation at you for doing that thing. And you kind of really knew it anyway, but you didn't want to admit it to yourself. And then all of a sudden you discover that friendship can bloom where only hatred had once been. And then you've got this one checked off. That's better. You get a little more energy out of it, too, because you free some attention. A little stress is gone. And you go to the next one on the list. That is the trick to being a great artist, to being a great metaphysician, to being truly connected spiritually, all that stuff. That's the trick, because that's how you begin to open up all the inner channels. Because things like pride and arrogance and contempt and criticism and hatred and, add whatever you like to the list, those things are blockages. There's a great universal flow. And every time you say, I don't like that, you cut off a finger. You're part of the same hand that is a part of. And the more things you decide you don't like, the less of a human being you are. The less creative, the less powerful, the less happy, the less serene. If you've ever noticed, people who are extremely bigoted, for example, don't tend to be jolly types. I, for one, have never met a happy bigot. And the more bigoted they are, the unhappier they are. And you can see it. They're, it eats into their features. That applies to everything. And so another aspect of this transmutation, which I also briefly alluded to, is to pick out the things you don't like in the world. Pick out the one thing that irks you the most. And don't rest until you figure out why it's good, why you should like it. Because there'll be a reason, there'll be an angle that you can look at it from. And from that angle, it's great. There's the old Hindu idea that, if you look at the world and you're a believer in Darwin and you say, well, the world's violent, and you've got to get out there and get your own, and all this sort of stuff, natural selection, taken to a rather violent human extreme. Well, you're looking at the tiger killing the antelope from the antelope's viewpoint. But if you look at the tiger killing the antelope from the tiger's viewpoint, there's a lot of mercy, a lot of wondrous things involved in the process of making that kill. And if you go a little further and take a look at it from a kind of cosmic viewpoint, the way life and death intertwine in this plane of existence, then you get a very beautiful picture, a kind of yin-yang diagram. Now, it's up to you at what level you wish to take it. But when you have a low opinion of something, always realize that a high opinion is available. An excellent experiment is, if you know someone, and almost all of us do, who you consider to be the most ignorant human being you've ever met. When you see them coming, you pull down the shutters and lock the doors and just pray that they will leave so you don't have to talk to them. Try something a little bit different. Invite them in, be real nice to them, and listen. Encourage them to talk. I guarantee you, they will shock you. They will say things you never thought they would be wise enough to understand. Because everyone is equal. The fellow who played lute for you just a few moments ago put this in a beautiful way not too long ago. And that was, he pointed out that in listening to a lecturer like Manly P. Hall, felt intimidated, he being a lecturer himself, until he realized that if you put a lute into Manly P. Hall's hand, everybody has their fields of specialty, their wondrous graces, their flashes of brilliance. Everybody. You just have to find them. You have to be willing to listen, to look for them. I mentioned Dickens earlier. One of the great delights of Dickens, despite his sometimes turgid prose, only because they, of course, wrote by the word for payment, is that he really loved to look at people. He found the most miserable, disgusting characters, Mr. Quilp, for example, in the Old Curiosity Shop, and just showed you everything about them, how wonderful they were in their rottenness. And you can definitely do that. It's a very good thing to do, as a matter of fact. Because, of course, in redeeming others in your own eyes, you are redeeming yourself. You're accepting those parts of yourself. If you say, I hate everybody who does this, somewhere deep down inside, there's some part of you that wants to do this. Because there's some part of us that wants to do everything. Hasn't been a saint born who hasn't at some point in his life thought about murder. Maybe it was just, I'd like to kill him, that sort of thing, but it's there. Everybody's got it. The very worst things you can find in humanity are right there living inside you, waving. The difference is that you don't give them the same kind of expression as other people do. You don't let them rule you. But you can certainly recognize them. You can find a way to give them a positive expression to relieve the stress that they produce. And when you do that, you can do something else. Maybe you can help relieve that stress in other people. And that's where the most important aspect of this whole idea of the Renaissance comes in. We've been really focusing first on the historical aspect and the way it kind of threads up to this time, and then on the very personal aspect, your relationships, your commitment to an art, those kinds of things, your commitment to taking risks in your art and in your life. But there's a third element involved also that we touched on in the idea of networking, and that is sharing. It may be that your talents, your contacts, your finances are less important to certain people than your enthusiasm, than the fact that you're out there, the fact that you're willing to get up in front of other people or at a cocktail party or over dinner and say, I'm dedicated to doing this. People ask you, well, what do you do? And you say, well, I'm a novelist. Oh, that's lovely. No, don't say you're a novelist. Say, I'm a novelist, but I'm dedicated to taking the novel to a whole new place. I want to revolutionize fiction. I want to make it so full of meaning and joy and humor that it transforms the people who read it. Now, yes, there will be people who look at you and go, oh, God. You don't need to be around them, and they needed to hear that anyway. But there will be other people who deep down inside want to be great musicians. And they'll hear you say that, and they'll think, somebody's doing it. And then along comes somebody else. They're off somewhere else. They drop into a lecture, and somebody says, yes, dedicate yourself. And then these things add together, and eventually they join in. They become another element. And when enough elements get involved, you've got critical mass. So your work, whatever it might be, that's the part of you that goes furthest out there. You don't get to go there with it. It's a problem. Most artists feel this, and that's why master craftsmanship is so necessary, because a master craftsman is somebody who is aware of every detail of the work. That's all it is. Every possible interpretation, every detail. They don't think about it as they're writing it, but when they go over it, they comb and comb and comb and comb and comb to make it as perfect as possible. Sometimes that takes a week. Quite truly. They can do it that fast, but it's 6 years of somebody else's work because they've gotten their eye that well honed. But that's the thing that you send way out there. So you hope that someday somebody picks up your book or they see your movie or whatever, they hear your music, and they really get inspired. They get jazzed up. It doesn't happen that often, unfortunately. There's a second element, which is when you get out there on Johnny Carson or whatever else, if you happen to get that successful, and you talk about your convictions and your ideals. That reaches more people. They hear you directly. They think, well, that's fascinating. This is a person with great dedication. But what is most important of all is direct contact. The people you know, the people you will meet, you meet them for a reason. You meet them to learn from them. You meet them to teach them. And also, you meet them because you can share something that is perhaps the most crucial thing of all to spiritual development, aspiration. The desire to really do it. In closing, I want to say that this is not going to be the beginning of a let's create a Renaissance Inc. It was pointed out to me by a rather wise fellow a couple of nights ago that the biggest problem that one faces with this sort of motion is that a bunch of other people come up and say, hey, let's create a Renaissance, and they don't do it with real dedication, and everything gets drowned out. You will not hear me speaking about this again unless a very compelling opportunity comes up, preferably to a different group of people. But you can watch what I do and what my friends do, because we are doing it. We're utterly dedicated. And there's enough of them that I felt strong enough to come up here and tell you about it without any fear of embarrassment in the next year or two. So it's happening. And you have a choice at this point. You can climb in right now. I can wait and see, watch what happens, climb in somewhere else down the line. It may get easier, it may get harder. But the dedication is already here. I'm going to close in my Tuesday night lecture series. I've been reading a poem. Art and I have been sharing poems. So I wrote one for this one. I will leave you with it. It's called The Renaissance, small r. The poet inspires a musician. The musician inspires a photographer. The photographer inspires a director. The director inspires a painter. That's how the Renaissance grows. How do they meet? by an overheard conversation, an impulse to hear a lecture, a sigh of appreciation. The Lord rides them to their destinations. Above them shines the spirit world. They see into it sometimes. They know. Down here, you know the Lord, but you know God up there. Thank you. There will be a study group, which I will lead in some odd number of minutes.